Well, good morning, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. This webinar is going to talk about the local Detroit CoC application process for new project funding for the 2026 competition. So real quick, just kind of what we have on the agenda for the day. I'm going to be giving a high-level overview of what the Continuum of Care competition is about. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so I might be a little bit struggling today, but we'll get through it. I'm also going to talk just briefly about some of the complexities that we have seen over the past really kind of 12 months as it relates to the 2025 and 2026 CoC competition, and kind of give folks an update of where we are now as it relates to the competition. Then we're going to dive into some timeline things. I'm going to go into some details about action that is needed if you are an agency that submitted an application earlier this year in January. And then for those on this call that did not submit an application earlier in January, or even if you did and you want to submit another application, we're going to go into details about the types of new projects that are available to apply for. So just some housekeeping tips. We are recording this webinar, and so this recording and the slides will be posted to HAND's website within the next day or two, certainly by early next week. I will drop the link to our website in the chat as well. Likewise, the RFP, the request for proposals, all of the application materials and everything are also posted on our website already, so you can access them there. And lastly, as we go throughout the meeting, you can feel free to drop questions in the chat. You can, raise your hand, and, come off of mute and ask questions kind of throughout the presentation. So don't feel like you have to hold all of your questions until the very end. And obviously, if you are not speaking, I do ask that you just keep yourself on mute, just to help kind of keep the background noise down. So also, before we get in, I do want to clarify what we are not going to be discussing today. So today we are not going to be discussing renewal project applications. So if you are here on this call and your agency currently receives CoC funding in Detroit and you're wondering kind of what the status is with your renewal project application or reapplying, we're not going to be talking about that today. That information is going to be coming out in probably the next 3 to 4 weeks. And so when that information is launched or provided, you will certainly receive communication about that. Also today, we are not going to be discussing transition grants. So a transition grant is a grant or an application that some of our current CoC funded permanent housing providers submitted, again, back in January, proposing to change their project type to a different type of project. We are not going to be discussing transition grants here either. They are currently being reviewed, and if your agency did submit a transition grant, there will be some more communication to you directly in the coming weeks if there hasn't been already. But if you did submit a transition grant, you're always welcome to reach out to me directly to kind of get an update on what's happening there. The other thing I want to set, just kind of to set the stage for today. So again, we are going to be talking about the process of applying for Continuum of Care funding, and I wanted to really make it clear at the beginning the types of new project applications that the CoC will be considering this year. So, and this is the same as what we had talked about back in November as well. So the types of new project applications that we will be considering are transitional housing, which includes transitional housing targeted to people who are fleeing domestic violence. We will also consider street outreach, what we call standalone supportive services only grants, coordinated entry grants, and dedicated HMIS grants, or Homeless Management Information System. So this year, we are not going to be considering new project applications for permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, or what's called a joint component transitional housing, rapid rehousing project type. I'll get into a little bit more details why, largely because of some restrictions that HUD is placing on the funding this year. But I just wanted to make that clear at the start that if you are here and you are interested in applying for, permanent supportive housing funding, unfortunately, this year we are not going to be considering new applications for PSH. Obviously, you are welcome to stay at this webinar. You're welcome to consider applying for any other project type, but I did just want to kind of set that stage at the beginning. The last thing I'm going to set the stage at the beginning before we actually get into the content for today. For those of you on this call who applied or submitted a new project application back in January, okay, I'm getting a message that the audio is not clear. Is anyone else having challenges? I will say that, okay. Thanks, Sophie. I am recovering from a cold, so my voice may sound a little scratchy if that's what you're hearing. But okay, thank you for everyone else. So if it is not clear on your end, you may want to try logging out and logging back in. Sometimes that clears things up. Okay, so real quick, if you submitted a new project application back in January, I'm going to go into this in more details later on, but I do just want to address this really quick at the front end, that you are going to be asked to either confirm that you do want your application to still be reviewed and considered in this year's competition. If so, your application will be reviewed as is, or you will have the opportunity to withdraw your application and essentially say, I changed my mind, I no longer want to be considered. If you do want to make changes to the application you submitted in January, you will need to withdraw it and essentially submit a new project application. I am going to go into this in some more details later on, but again, I wanted to just mention this at the top because I know many of you on this call did submit a new project application in January. And so you're probably wondering, like, why am I here? What am I going to be asked to do? Briefly, that is what you're going to be asked to do, but again, we will go into some more details. Okay. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I do want to take a couple of minutes to give an overview of what the Continuum of Care competition is all about. I recognize there may be some people on this call for whom the Continuum of Care funding or Continuum of Care competition is like a new thing, maybe not something you're have a lot of experience in. So just want to give a really high level overview on what the competition is all about. So the Continuum of Care, or CoC, you're going to see that acronym all throughout today. The CoC competition is the process by which over 400 CoCs across the country apply to HUD for funding, for Continuum of Care funding. A Continuum of Care is a region or a city or a county, with a specific geographical jurisdiction, and they're split up kind of all different ways. In Detroit, our CoC jurisdiction is the city of Detroit, then the cities of Hamtramck and Highland Park. So that's the Detroit CoC. So CoCs all across the country, there's about 400 of them, apply to HUD annually for CoC funding. HUD awards those CoCs funding based on a number of factors, based on the amount of funding that HUD has available from the appropriations. The funding is awarded based on the individual projects that are submitted and how they align with HUD's priorities. And the funding is awarded based on the application score that the CoC receives on the application that is submitted. CoC funding is competitive, meaning that the Detroit CoC is competing against all other CoCs around the country for these funds. So it's not like an entitlement program or other sources of funding. It is a competitive application process. So HAND, the Homeless Action Network of Detroit, has been designated by the Detroit Continuum of Care as the collaborative applicant. That is a specific role that we fulfill. And that means that our role is to lead and manage the continuum of care application process. So that's why throughout the entire process here, you're going to be hearing from hand. We have been designated to play that role. So particularly what we're going to be talking about today as it relates to new project funding, there are two primary sources of funding that will be made available to us to fund new projects. One is what we call, or what HUD calls, CoC bonus. This is estimated, we're estimating this year we'll have about $10 million in CoC bonus funding. This can fund a variety of projects and can serve a broad range of people who are experiencing homelessness. There's another pot or source of funding called domestic violence bonus, or DV bonus. We are anticipating to have about $5 million in DV bonus funding this year. DV bonus can fund more limited types of programs, and those programs must serve people who are fleeing domestic violence. So it's a specific source of funding made available to serve a specific population. Lastly, the CoC may take funding from existing projects. So of the currently funded CoC projects, may take funding from those projects and combine it with CoC bonus funding to fund new projects. That process is called reallocation. We have done reallocation in the past. We won't know until a little bit later this year, probably about July, if there is going to be any reallocated funds, because that is kind of tied up with our review of our renewal projects. So we'll kind of have a clearer picture of that in the coming months. So when we think about the CoC competition, I often frame it as there being kind of two main branches to the competition. There's the local application process. That's the process by which the CoC board sets funding priorities and ultimately decides which projects are going to be submitted to HUD for funding. Even with this local application process, ultimately HUD makes the final funding decisions. There's then the national application process, and that's where the CoC, and again, in our role as the collaborative applicant, submits an overall CoC application to HUD. There's a lot of things that go into that application. That application is then reviewed by HUD and scored. And it's the score on that application that will impact the amount of funding that we receive. Again, getting back to this notion of this being a competitive application process. So today, our conversation about new project funding is kind of that first branch. It's around that local application process that we're talking about here. Later on in the coming months, we'll be talking more about the national application process. We don't have a ton to say about that right now. We have some, but not a lot, partly because the 2026 Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, has not yet been released. The NOFO is the official kind of document from HUD that lays out HUD's funding priorities. It lays out, when things are due to HUD. It lays out how CoCs are going to be scored. That NOFO has not yet been released for 2026. We are anticipating it will be released by June. We typically always launch our local application process before the NOFO is formally released. Because once that NOFO is released, we typically have 60 to 90 days to kind of turn everything around and get it into HUD. Because that is a really short time frame, there's always pieces to the process that we start before the NOFO is released. We are assuming that the 2026 NOFO is going to mirror very much a NOFO that HUD released back in December that they were not able to actually implement. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in terms of why HUD was not able to implement their 2025 NOFO. But regardless, we have that 2025 NOFO to refer to help provide guidance and direction on what we're anticipating the competition will look like this year. And then once that 2026 NOFO is released, if there's any, if any of our current plans are contradictory to what is in the NOFO, we will adjust as needed. Again, this is part of our typical protocol that we normally do in terms of when we roll out local processes ahead of when the NOFO is released. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about what has happened over the past 12 months with the 2025 competition. I know particularly for those on this call who have been in various meeting spaces with the CoC over the past year, we have talked about these things, and you may have some questions as well in terms of what is happening with your current CoC program. I also want to share this kind of with everyone, even if you don't currently receive CoC funding, just to give an understanding of the type of environment that we are currently operating in as it relates to HUD, kind of the current administration and what's happening with the continuum of care funding. So, the past 12 months have really been fraught with a lot of confusion and some litigation. And again, I just want to make sure that we kind of have an understanding of this so that we're clear on sort of what's happening. I'm going to start, though, with going back to 2024, so about 2 years ago. So in 2024, HUD, again, obviously under the prior administration, released a 2-year NOFO. Typically, the NOFOs are released every year, and we do this annual competition annually. Back in 2024, HUD released a 2-year NOFO, indicating that there would be a 2-year funding cycle. So we held the typical normal competition in 2024. And with that, we anticipated there would be no competition in 2025, but rather all of our current projects that were funded in 2024 would just be automatically renewed for another grant term. That was kind of our assumption going into 2025. In the summer, in July of 2025, HUD communicated that they intended to release a 2025 NOFO. Obviously, at this point, we have a new administration in office. And with that communication, there were some hints that the administration may be making some changes in their funding priorities in terms of what they wanted to use their CoC funding for. So we kind of first got hints of that in July of last year. So then in November, so there was really not much happened between July and November, other than a government shutdown, which kind of delayed some things. So in November, HUD did release an fiscal year 2025 NOFO. There were significant shifts in HUD's priorities in that NOFO, and there was a very short time frame for CoCs to make funding decisions and submit applications to HUD. Back in November, the hand on behalf of the CoC, we released our local new project RFP in response to that NOFO. And in that RFP, we invited applications for transitional housing, street outreach, supportive services only, coordinated entry, and HMIS. So the same types of projects that we are currently accepting applications for. Back in November, we had an initial application deadline of December 12th. It was a very quick turnaround time because of the timelines that HUD had in that November NOFO. Late November, then, there were some lawsuits that were filed against HUD in response to that November NOFO. 2 lawsuits were filed. The judge combined them into one case, but essentially it went to court. So in December, HUD rescinded that November NOFO. They essentially pulled it back and said, nope, we're not going to do this. They did make a statement, though, that they intended to re-release that a 2025 NOFO. They rescinded it. Our understanding is largely in response to the lawsuits that were filed. So even with this rescission of that November NOFO, we still kept our local application for new projects open. We pushed our deadline back to January. So again, when I'm talking about January applications that were submitted, this is where that January deadline came in. Because there was a lot that was unknown in late December, we didn't know if or when HUD would be able to re-release their their 2025 NOFO. We kept our local application process open and just pushed that deadline back to January. As it relates to the court case, there was an initial hearing held in December, and the judge ruled that HUD could not implement their 2025 NOFO the way that they wanted to without going through a legal review. And rather, the judge said you have to start the process of awarding projects under that 2-year NOFO. You'll recall that 2-year NOFO that was released in November. The judge essentially said, you can't release your own 2025 NOFO. You have to go back to that 2-year NOFO. So HUD they did release an updated NOFO, 2025 NOFO in December, but for public review. They were not able to implement it. So when we refer to the December NOFO, that's the one we're referring to, the one that HUD did release, but they just were not able to actually implement. But it does give us an understanding of what HUD's plans are. So fast forward to February, there was some language that was included in the congressional appropriations directing HUD to start issuing FY 2025 project awards on kind of a staggered basis. Also in February, HUD appealed the decision that did not allow them to release their own 2025 NOFO. The court in March, the court denied HUD's appeal. And then in late March, HUD did start making some award announcements for current existing projects that had expired in the first part of this calendar year, January to March. HUD has also communicated consistently that they intend to release a 2026 NOFO by June. That was also a requirement of that appropriations language. And so where we are today is there have been no additional award announcements for fiscal year 2025 or, again, our currently funded projects, apart from the few that were awarded based on that announcement that was made a few weeks ago. There is appropriations language that has directed HUD to start making these awards, and they just have not started doing that yet. So I bring this up just to note that we are in a really unusual situation this year where we are looking at entering and starting a local competition without really having formal notice of which of our existing projects have received awards for another grant year. We are anticipating and hoping that HUD will be making those award announcements very soon. Again, these are award announcements for our currently funded projects whose current grant terms are ending at some point in 2026. And so they're really kind of waiting for that announcement from HUD for their continued funding. So we are anticipating and hoping that HUD will make those announcements soon. But again, as of today, we don't have that information. And so again, I bring this up because it is really unusual for us to be entering into kind of starting our local process absent all of those award announcements. But this is kind of where we are in this arena. I will also note as well that the final court ruling with these lawsuits is still pending. So we don't have a final ruling yet. It's unknown at what point that ruling may come. So I realized that was a lot kind of in the weeds, and I apologize if that was a little too much. But again, I wanted to set the stage to show sort of the type of environment that we are operating in as it relates to what's been happening with the NOFO and the funding over the past year or so. Okay, I'm going to continue on. If you do have questions or if there's anything you need me to clarify, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to ask particularly my colleague Christian, if you can keep an eye, if you see any hands raised, just let me know. But we will otherwise just continue on so we can make sure to get through the material. And Matt, I do see your questions in the chat, and I will be sure to get to that before we end. So I referenced earlier that the NOFOs that HUD released in 2025, both that November NOFO that they took off the table and then that December NOFO that they released for public review, had a number of significant changes in them. We are anticipating that the NOFO that's going to be released in June will mirror that December NOFO. Again, HUD has basically shown their hand. They kind of have made it clear the direction they want to go in. So I want to talk briefly about these kind of significant changes that we have seen in the NOFO, and not only in the NOFO, but based on other things that we have heard HUD say in various public spaces. So HUD is limiting the amount of funding the CoC can use for permanent housing projects. I'm going to go over kind of a lot of these in a little bit more detail. HUD has changed what are called the Tier 1 and Tier 2 funding levels. This impacts the amount of funding that we may ultimately receive. There are some shifts, again, in their priorities in terms of what they hope to accomplish with these CoC funds. And they have also made some changes to the CoC application scoring itself. So let's talk first about the 30% permanent housing cap. So again, if you have been in any of the various meeting spaces that we have held with the CoC over the past few months, this is probably not new information. HUD is capping the amount of funding that the CoC may use for permanent housing. Permanent housing includes permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and what we call a joint component project, transitional housing, rapid rehousing. All three of those project types are under the permanent housing umbrella. So this cap is set to 30% of our annual renewal demand. Annual renewal demand is essentially, it's the amount of funding that it would take for us. It's an amount of funding that is allocated to us, and keep it as straightforward. We currently use about 90% of our funds to fund permanent housing projects. And we are going to be required to only use 30% of those funds. So that is a significant difference. I'll note too that this cap primarily applies, again, to our current permanent housing programs. So again, we currently allocate almost $23 million, about $24 million more to these permanent housing programs than what HUD will allow in this year's competition. So that means for many of our existing permanent housing programs, and our existing programs that currently receive this funding, will not be able to be submitted to HUD as permanent housing. So those projects may transition to another project type, or we may not be able to submit them at all. There are recommendations that are being developed through a couple of different committees. Right now, that work is happening now on which current permanent housing projects will be submitted to HUD under that cap. And we anticipate that the CoC board will make those decisions in May. So again, if you were at any of the kind of community input meetings that we had over the course of March, we talked about this, in depth, and got a lot of input from the community on factors that we should consider when making these decisions. So due to this cap, though, again, this cap which applies to our current permanent housing projects, this is why we are not entertaining new applications for permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, or those joint component project types. Again, because of these limits that HUD is setting on these project types, we are going to be focusing on what of our existing permanent housing projects are going to be funded under that cap. The other significant change that HUD has made has to do with our what's called the Tier 1 and Tier 2 funding thresholds. So again, these are funding thresholds. They're both represent dollar amounts. The Tier 1 is an amount of funding that the CoC is kind of guaranteed to receive, versus the amount of funding that we consider safe, that we know will be received. Decisions on which projects ultimately are going to end up in Tier 1 or Tier 2 will be made by the board later this summer. But essentially, historically, projects that were placed with that Tier 1 funding amount were safe, and we knew that we would receive. Projects that were placed in Tier 2 would be awarded based on our CoC application score. So again, that's where that national application, that national competition piece comes in that I referenced earlier, where the score on our application impacts how much funding we receive. And we see that as it relates to projects that are in Tier 2. Those projects are awarded based on some factors, but the main factor is that they are based on how well we score overall as a CoC. So historically, 90% of our funds would be in Tier 1, or would be safe. So we know we would get at least 90% of the funding that we applied for. The remaining 10% we may or may not receive based on how we performed. That was historically consistent kind of ever since I've been doing this work, which has been some time. This year, we anticipate that Tier 1 will be limited to 60% of the amount of funding that we can apply for. So there's a significant difference from what we have seen in the past. And then that the remaining 40% of the funding that we can apply for will be awarded, again, based on how well our CoC scores. So we are looking at having a significantly greater proportion of our projects that we're going to submit at risk of not being funded. This is a part of one of HUD's kind of shift in priorities in wanting to increase competition for these funds and moving away from CoCs kind of automatically being guaranteed 90% of their funds. So this is kind of one of those shifts that HUD is making. So right now, the policies on how projects are going to be ranked into Tier 1 or Tier 2 are still in development. It's going to be a little bit before those policies are developed and finalized. Ultimately, we anticipate that it's going to be later this summer, probably in August, when the board will be making those final decisions on what's going to be ranked in Tier 1 and what will be ranked in Tier 2. The last thing I want to note, and then I'll answer some of the questions in the chat, is this is just a really brief summation of some of the key shifts in HUD's priorities that we have seen HUD signal. And we've seen this signaling through what was published in those 2025 NOFOs. HUD has reiterated this in various public community forums, in various written communication. So HUD has been pretty clear in terms of what they are shifting towards. The first one being a movement away from housing first and moving towards requiring service participation. So housing first has been the kind of underlying, you could say, kind of approach to services and housing that's been implemented here, and that had been a priority of the administration for the past decade or so. Housing first in some states that our first course of action is to place people into housing, and then we provide wraparound services to help them maintain that housing. The services are provided based on the extent to which that individual chooses to participate in the services. HUD is moving away from housing first and rather moving towards requiring service participation for people in these programs. There's also an increased focus on substance abuse treatment, particularly within the transitional housing programs or other project types. HUD is very much tying substance use with homelessness, which we know is certainly a challenge for some people who experience homelessness. They are really increasing their focus on treatment programs, treatment protocol to be embedded within the CoC funded programs. And lastly, there is an increased focus on self-sufficiency, and that these programs ultimately helping people to become self-sufficient, which HUD has not thoroughly defined. I have heard them define it in part as meaning people ultimately exit these CoC funded programs to non-subsidized housing. That is kind of one aspect of self-sufficiency, along with, I should say, too, wanting to see people increase their employment income, not necessarily increase the amount of benefits, government benefits they're receiving, but rather increase their employment income. So movement to self-sufficiency is also a kind of significant priority shift that they are making. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment because I have seen some questions in the chat related to this that I do want to address. So Dawn, your question about are these changes outlined in the 2026 NOFO? So the 2026 NOFO has not yet been released. We are, again, anticipating that it will be released by June. So everything that I'm talking about here is what we have seen in the 2025 NOFO, which, again, that is the NOFO HUD was not able to actually implement. But both that document and then, again, what we have heard HUD speak to either in public settings or in other kind of written communication. That's kind of where we are pulling this from. The percentage, so Tara's question, is the percentage different with Tier 1 and Tier 2 in the 2026 NOFO that they tried to publish in 2025? Yes. So the December 2025 NOFO had set the Tier 1 limit at 30%, which is even more drastic. Going back to some of that congressional appropriation language that was passed in February, that language included a requirement that Tier 1 could be no lower than 60%. So assuming that HUD follows through with what Congress has directed them to do, Tier 1 will be no lower than 60%. It could be higher. I would be surprised if it was higher than 60%, but Congress has essentially directed them for this year. They cannot set it lower than 60%. So that is a change. And then Pam's questions, if new projects most likely end in Tier 2, will those projects need to be annually applied for under competitive funding? It makes it very difficult to create a robust program without more than 1 year of somewhat protected funding stream from the CoC at least. Yeah, so there's maybe you can address a couple of things in there. So the first thing I will address is this year we are allowing new project applicants to apply for multi-year grants. So in the new project application, you can apply for, a 2-year grant, 3-year grant. I think it's up to a 5-year grant, which means if your project is funded, if HUD funds it, you will have that CoC funding for 5 years. And then after that 5 years, when you come up for renewal, we would go through the process of submitting for renewal. All of our renewal projects, so our existing projects, are on 1-year funding cycles. And that is how HUD does it, really. That's not a local decision that the CoC makes. That is how these projects operate. So when I talk about our, existing current CoC funded projects, they all get their grants they're all 12-month terms, 1-year terms. So after that first initial grant term ends, assuming everything has gone well, that project would then be eligible to renew, and it would then renew in 12-month increments. So to the other part of your question about will new projects end up in Tier 2, kind of will they be in Tier 1? Again, those decisions have not yet been made. There's a lot of things that are being taken into consideration as we are developing those ranking policies, taking into consideration the more projects we put in projects that put in Tier 1. Do we want to prioritize new projects, prioritize holding safe some of our existing programs? How do we want to find that balance? Again, those decisions are still being made, and unfortunately won't be able to have won't be able to tell you by the time these applications are due where new projects are going to be ranked in that ranking. Excuse me, I need to blow my nose just a moment. So I wish I could give you some more clarity on that in terms of, yes, we know for sure where new projects will be ranked. I know that could be helpful for you as you are developing your applications. Unfortunately, I just don't have that information at this time. That is also not unusual. I will note, typically, again, we do launch our new project application process before we have the ranking policies established. Okay. So Teresa's question, how will service participation be measured and documented, and what are the intended consequences of not participating? That is an excellent question. We have those same questions. So we anticipate that HUD will expect applicants to submit with their application to HUD a copy of whatever service participation agreement your agency is going to use. I will say that we are intending to develop some CoC-wide expectations or protocol as it relates to service participation. That process, that work hasn't quite gotten off the ground yet. It probably will within the coming months, so keep an eye on for that. But that's one way. I guess HUD is going to be looking for, hey, in your application, we expect to see this documentation that you have. What are the intended consequences of not participating? That I don't know. HUD has not. So on the one hand, HUD has not clarified what they expect. I will say from the CoC's perspective, we are hoping that, these projects don't continue to serve people in a way that is full of compassion and grace and wants to keep people housed, even if someone perhaps is having a hard time engaging in services. So again, that is part of what we are hoping to develop with kind of our overall policies, as wanting to make clear of what do we expect as the CoC with these service participation, requirements. And I don't have a better answer than that at this point. Partly because, again, HUD has not clarified. So Jenny's question, can you speak to how anticipate HUD will rate or score CoCs for Tier 2 funding? Yes. So as I mentioned, projects that land in Tier 2 are all scored themselves. Projects in Tier 1 are considered safe. For the sake of our argument, let's say HUD kind of automatically funds them. Automatically, everything is in air quotes. The projects that end up in Tier 2, HUD takes all of those projects from around the country, every CoC's Tier 2 projects, and scores them all on a 100-point scale. Half of those points, half of the points that a Tier 2 project can earn, are directly related to the score that CoC earns on its CoC application. So again, the higher our CoC scores on our application, the more points our Tier 2 projects will earn. Other points that those Tier 2 projects can earn, one relates to where they are ranked in Tier 2. So the higher a project is ranked in Tier 2, the more points it will earn. And then if a Tier 2 project affirms that it will require service participation, it can additionally earn points. So HUD takes all of those factors, assigns a score to all the Tier 2 projects around the country, and then starts funding them from the highest scoring to the lowest until HUD runs out of money. That was a really high-level overview of how the Tier 2 scoring goes. So Teresa's other question, is it possible that the projects waiting on approval will be bundled in the 26 NOFO and decreasing that 60% guarantee?
Hey, Amanda, just to clarify,
yes,
all I'm wondering
yes,
is, sorry.
No, you're fine.
Will they I mean, is it possible they're going to be bundled in the 26 NOFO and then the 60% already that major decrease down to 60% is going to be perhaps even more decreased because these projects are already getting funded within that 60%?
So we have not yet decided which projects are going to be funded with the 60% or the tier one projects. We are going with the assumption that all of our current projects, those that are waiting on their 2025 grant agreement. Well, let me back up. First of all, we're assuming they're going to get those grant agreements before this NOFO comes out, so that we will know, and they should be all renewed for another year. However, given that the majority of those projects are permanent housing, only a small portion of those projects will be submitted for renewal as permanent housing. And that's kind of a separate line of decisions making that we're kind of going through right now. For our other current renewal projects that are not going to be submitted as permanent housing, if they are a permanent housing project, again, they may transition to another project type, or they may be reallocated entirely, meaning we may not submit them for renewal at all. But where they are ranked in, if they're ranked within that 60% tier one, or if they ranked in tier two, again, we haven't made those decisions yet. It's not guaranteed. I can't say for sure that our existing projects will be in tier one and no new projects will be in tier one. We just haven't made those decisions yet. I don't know if that's getting to your question.
You're okay. And I'm sorry to make you go through the jumps. I think maybe my question is completely ridiculous. I was just wondering if the 2025 NOFO, the awards that are supposed to be provided under that NOFO, is there any possibility they just won't fund and they'll put everybody into the current 2026 competition?
I see. I don't anticipate that happening. I anticipate that our current projects that are waiting for their 2025 awards will receive those awards. And I'm saying that because there's congressional appropriations language directing HUD to make these awards. Again, it's a matter of HUD following through and now doing what Congress has directed them to do. But I do anticipate them doing that. So, okay. So Elena's question was, does non-subsidized housing, so I was talking about kind of HUD's movement towards self-sufficiency, does that equate to affordable housing units, or is the idea that they exit to marketplace housing? So the best that I've heard from HUD is their expectation is that people are moving to non-subsidized housing. They've only used non-subsidized. So if there is, I mean, when you talk about affordable housing, there's some kind of complexities there in terms of like, why is it affordable? Is there a subsidy attached to it? Is it a tax credit project? Again, depending on kind of some of the nuances of a particular housing project, it may or may not kind of fall within what HUD considers unsubsidized. The long and the short of it is that HUD is wanting to see people exit these programs without additional government assistance, that they're able to pay for their housing on their own, that they have an income, employment, other supports that they need without any type of government assistance. Let me see. I think I'm trying to get these all. As Jean's question, in the multi-year grants, are there cost of living adjustments like in the renewal process? So just kind of for context, our current grants, our renewal, when they come up for renewal every year, HUD has historically made some automatic increases in the budget to account for changes in fair market rent and cost of living adjustments. That happens when the project is renewed. So for multi-year grants, that adjustment won't be made until the project comes up for renewal the first time. So if you say you are awarded a 3-year grant, that is the pot of money that you have for those 3 years. I mean, it's anticipated that for the most part, you're going to spend a third of it every year. I mean, there may be some variations, but broadly, that's the expectation. It won't be until essentially year 4 when the project renews, and if it's funded, that you would see any cost of living adjustments or any increases in the budget. Once if a new project is funded for a multi-year grant, that's the grant. That's the amount that you have for those years. There's no, HUD is not gonna, midway through the grant, tack on a few thousand more dollars because of cost of living adjustments mid-grant. Okay, Joan's question, if HAND approves a 5-year project, and if I will note, it's the CoC board that approves anything that's submitted to HUD, but if a 5-year project is submitted to HUD and approved by HUD, would there be any annual, sorry, my scrolling is a little weird. Would there be any annual requirements other than renewing a HUD renewal application? So if you are awarded an annual or a multi-year grant, you do have to submit an annual report to HUD every year. It's called the APR, Annual Performance Report. We can provide additional guidance on that. I mean, obviously there's HMIS reporting that has to be done along the way, but in terms of annual reporting, it's largely going to be the APR to HUD. There will be, again, within HMIS, housing inventory reports, point in time count reports, but you do not have to reapply every year for funding if you are awarded a multi-year grant. Okay. And then I know there was an earlier question from Matt regarding if all of these instructions that I'm giving, if they pertain to new projects as well as expansion projects. And yes, they do. So maybe I should have answered that at the beginning, but essentially everything that I'm talking about here applies to both new and expansion. Okay, I think I am up to speed on the questions. All right, I'm going to continue on. I'm going to talk, but again, feel free to continue to drop questions in the chat. So let's talk about some timeline stuff. So the biggest thing, the biggest date that you want to keep in mind is May 8th. So May 8th, this is when applications are due to HAND. I think, we were saying by like 12:59 p.m. So before the clock ticks over to May 9th, May 8th, everything is due. This includes, again, this kind of confirmation or withdrawal statement for agencies that submitted back in January. So if you're going to be submitting anything, it is due by May 8th. I give the rest of the timeline here in terms of what we anticipate. This is all subject to change once the NOFO is released, but largely we anticipate the board will be making decisions on which new projects to submit to HUD in August. If your project is selected, there will be an additional step entering this project into an online system called eSnaps. That is HUD's application system. I will provide additional guidance kind of at that time if that is something that will apply to you. And then we anticipate HUD making award announcements by the end of this calendar year. Again, this is all subject to change, but this is what we're looking at right now. The biggest date to keep in mind is May 8th. Okay, I'm going to go into some details now for those on this call that submitted a new project application back in January. So again, you turned your stuff in back in January. As you recall, when we kind of went over the timeline of what happened over the course of late 2025 and early 2026, there was a lot that was just really unknown in terms of what was happening with HUD and the competition at that time. So even though we still kept our local process open and we accepted applications, we did not have a pathway to submit them to HUD because there essentially was no 2025 competition that was open. So you'll recall when you submitted your application, I said, thank you, we got it. Things are kind of on hold for now. So where we're at now is that we are reopening our new project request for proposals, or RFPs, to invite both new applicants and new agencies, so anyone that did not submit in January, but also we are requiring January applicants to either confirm that you still want that January submission to be reviewed or to withdraw it from consideration. Essentially, what we are asking is that you communicate to us where you're at and what action you would like to be taken. And so again, we're doing this now because the 2026 NOFO will be released soon. And so because we are, again, we wanted to open this up to new agencies to apply that did not apply earlier, but also needed a process to hear from those that had applied earlier. I will also note that this RFP that we have just released, for new projects, it is the same as what was released back in November. Same project types, same evaluation criteria, same forms, same questions in the application. Everything is the same. So if you are we're going to call you a January applicant. If you submitted your application in January, here is what you are asked to do by May 8th. You are asked to either confirm the review of your previously submitted application, meaning you are confirming that, yes, I want what I submitted in January to be reviewed as it is. I'm going to show you the form that we do need you to fill out. It's pretty straightforward and basic, but essentially that's all you submit. You don't have to rewrite your application. You don't have to redo your budget form. You don't have to resubmit attachments. All you need to submit is this one form saying, I'm confirming that what I submitted in January, I want to be reviewed, evaluated, considered for funding in this year's competition. Or if maybe something has changed on your end and you want to withdraw that application. You would withdraw your application if you no longer want it to be considered for funding. So if you withdraw the application, what was submitted in January will not be reviewed, will not be evaluated, scored. We will essentially just kind of set it to the side and not even consider it. The important thing I want to note is that if you want to make changes to what you submitted in January, you must withdraw what you submitted and resubmit a new application. So let's say in the application you submitted in January, you're thinking, man, I really wish I had answered a certain question a different way. I wish I had talked about this thing in my application. I think I could strengthen this response, or I want to make changes to my budget. If you want to make any type of changes, you have to withdraw what you submitted in January and then submit a new application, again, all by May 8th. This is a particular note, this is kind of nuanced, but a particular note for projects that submitted a transitional housing application in January and requested rental assistance. So if this applies to you, and there are only a few, and I will also, reach out and make sure that this is clear. HUD has clarified that a nonprofit organization cannot administer rental assistance for transitional housing programs. So again, this only applies to a handful of the applicants that were submitted. So if you are a nonprofit organization, which hopefully you are, and you submitted a transitional housing application in January, and you requested rental assistance, if you want your application to still be considered, you do need to withdraw that application and resubmit it with either a different budget line other than rental assistance, like a leasing budget line, or if you really want to keep that rental assistance as a part of your program, the application would have to be resubmitted with an eligible applicant that's a state or local unit of government or public housing authority. So I know this is really nuanced. This was just a clarification that came to light from HUD a couple of weeks ago. Again, this really only applies to a small number of folks on this call, and I will also reach out to you directly just to make sure that this is clear. But this fits within kind of this overarching notion that if you need to make any changes to your application, it does need to be withdrawn and then resubmitted. So I'm going to real quick go over this form that needs to be submitted. And this is posted on our website in Word format. So you just need to download it, fill it out, and get it to me by May 8th. This first page just gives these same instructions. I'll kind of come back to that. But you're going to submit one of these forms for each of the applications submitted in January. I know there's some folks on this call that submitted more than one application in January, which is fine. You can submit as many as you want. I need a separate form for each of those applications. For each application, you're going to select one of two options. You're going to select one, either just place a check mark to confirm that you want what you submitted in January to be reviewed. You're going to enter the project name, what project type. There's, kind of some bullet points here that you understand. That means the January submission will be reviewed as is. You don't need to submit anything else. And then there's a signature spot. The other option to submit on this form is to withdraw. So again, you would place a check mark, an X, what have you, by withdraw, confirming that you are withdrawing your application from consideration. And then with the understanding that what you submitted in January will not be reviewed, but also with the understanding that you may either submit a modified version of that new application. You can submit something completely different. Essentially, if you withdraw what you submitted in January, that does not stop you from still submitting a new project application. So maybe another example, say in January you submitted for a transitional housing program and you're like, no, you know what, that no longer fits with what I want to do as an agency. I want to do street outreach instead. You can withdraw your transitional housing application and submit a new project application for street outreach. We're not trying to limit it here in terms of what you can or cannot do. The last thing I want to note, and this is particularly important, is that if you submitted in January and we don't receive anything from you by May 8th, we are going to automatically assume that you are withdrawing your application. So sort of a non-response, we are going to consider that being a withdrawal. So that's just really want to make that clear, that if you applied in January and if you don't submit anything to us, either basically, if you don't submit to us confirming that by May 8th that you want your application reviewed, we are going to automatically withdraw it and take it out of consideration, and it won't be reviewed. Okay, I see questions in the chat about this. So let me, Okay, Angel, I see I did answer that question. So Elena, your question, I'm going to come back to the rental assistance question. So I will kind of come back to that. So Jean, your question, if you withdraw the intent to resubmit, can you then take a look at all of the line items for any changes that may be needed? Yes. If you withdraw your January submission, we're not going to consider it. So basically you would then take the new project application forms, fill them out, develop your application, develop your responses however you want. That may mean I initially applied for these types of costs, or I requested this much. Well, now I need to apply for these types of costs, or I want to request this much. So you can make any changes. If you withdraw and you resubmit, we're not going to compare those two applications. We're only going to look at what was resubmitted in May. The January one is essentially off the table. We're only going to look at what was submitted now in May. So you can make any kind of adjustments that you want to it. So if you applied in January and you feel good about your application, you don't need to make any changes. Things are really pretty straightforward and hopefully simple for you. You just need to fill out this one form, this one document, turn it in, and you're done. You don't need to rewrite your application. And trying to hopefully save you a little bit of work on that end. I do want to add touch briefly on this rental assistance question, and then Jane, I'll take your hand. So regarding the rental assistance, so our understanding is that for a transitional housing program, which again, that's the only kind of housing program type that we're considering here, that it is a unit of local government or a public housing authority is the only type of entity that's eligible to be the direct recipient for those funds, the rental assistance funds, and then essentially cut those rent checks to the landlords. A nonprofit service provider could be brought on as a subrecipient to provide the services to the people in the transitional housing program. But the rental assistance part of it needs to be managed by that other entity. This is a very kind of nuanced, buried in the regulations type thing that honestly just came to light a couple of weeks ago. Okay, Jane, I see your hand.
Okay. If we withdraw and resubmit, can we use the same forms that we used when we submitted in January?
So, no, not really, but kind of yes, because I would ask that you use the forms that are currently posted on HAND's website. Now, these are the same forms that were in January. What has changed is the footer. I basically updated the footer to say,
okay.
So the questions are the same. So you can copy and paste the text that you put in that other form and copy and paste it over into the new form. Obviously reread it to make sure it still makes sense, but the questions are the same. The attachments are the same. Like really the only thing that has changed in the forms is the date on it. But I would ask that you do use the new forms so that I see clear, like again, that footer. I know this is the 2026 footer.
Okay.
Yep.
Back to the rental assistance. Oh, I'm sorry.
Clarify too that everything we're talking about here is not transition grants. I just wanted to we're not talking about withdrawing transition grants. It's only for new projects, non-transition. I just wanted to make that
Wait a minute. Okay, so what I submitted in January for the transition grant, I leave it as it is, right?
Yes.
I don't have to do anything.
You don't have to do anything.
Best day ever. Okay, now back to the the rental assistance.
Sure.
Why can't, because mine says transition with rental assistance. You're keeping it, right?
So I know, Jane, we communicated previously about your transition grant. Yeah.
I'm going to roll the dice. Let me tell you why. Because why can't, it doesn't say the grantee must be a PHA or a unit of government. It says a unit of government or a PHA must administer the rental assistance. Why can't a nonprofit be the grantee and have a sub agreement with a PHA or unit of government, which is never going to happen, but just to say it does, okay? Why can't it be that way?
That is an excellent question. So,
because let me just tell you the lay of the land. To get a PHA or an entitlement community to submit, everybody just think about this for a second and what that would take to get this through an entitlement community's administrative process to get this submitted or to be a subrecipient. So I'm not suggesting that. What I'm saying is, why can't the nonprofit be the grantee and say they're going to enter into a subrecipient agreement with the eligible administrator?
I suppose that could be possible. And if you are on this call and if that is something that you are interested in doing, I'm happy to, talk about that more directly. Here's and I'm going to dive into a little bit more of the history of some of this just real quick to give some context for those folks who may be new to this. Years ago, 15 years ago, nonprofit organizations were not allowed to administer rental assistance for any of HUD's programs, permanent housing or otherwise. HUD made a change and an accommodation in the law, in the statute, that to again, back in the day, for example, it would be like our state government, or we had, some local government that was the direct recipient of these rental assistance grants, and they sub-granted with nonprofits to provide the services. HUD made a change in the law years ago that allowed nonprofits to receive that rental assistance and administer it directly only for permanent housing programs. This, again, was the thing that just came to light recently, is that change in the statute did not apply to transitional housing programs. Why? I don't know. Probably because 10 years ago, we were moving away from transitional housing anyway. So I don't have all of the questions or the answers, I think, to your questions, Jane. I will say a couple of things. If everything I'm talking about here in terms of nonprofit, transitional housing, rental assistance, if that applies to you based on what you have previously submitted, I either already have reached out to you for that conversation, or I will be reaching out to you just to clarify and to identify some next steps. So just to kind of like maybe, because that doesn't really apply to everyone here and it's very nuanced. The last thing I want to clarify too, that I think Jane referenced, everything I'm talking about regarding confirmation or withdrawal of applications is for new projects. It's not for transition grants. Again, a transition grant was submitted by an existing permanent housing provider proposing to transition to another project type. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking really about anything today regarding transition grants. This confirmation or withdrawal process is only for those new project applications that submitted in January. All right, there are a couple of additional questions. So Lakeisha, I see your question asking if I can repeat that. I'm not sure what I need to repeat. So please, if you want to, you can either clarify in the chat or come off of mute.
Sure. So you were giving the description of transitional housing, and I wanted to make sure I understood that. So for a new project, right, for transitional housing, that it must be administered via a PHA or a local government. Is that correct?
Only if your grant was going to request a rental assistance budget line.
Okay, so no.
If a lot of our transitional housing applications that were submitted requested like a operations budget line or supportive services budget line or a leasing budget line, and HMIS and admin, in all of those instances, a nonprofit all the way. You don't need a PHA, you don't need a government entity. Gotcha. It only is that specific rental assistance budget line. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, a couple of other questions in the chat that I want to address. So Linda, your question, can I repeat what I anticipate will happen with the current FY 2024 grants that end in Q4? Your ends in March or July 31st. So my anticipation and assumption, so FY 2024 grants are all of our existing projects. HUD should be making award announcements for your project for the FY25 term at some point. When, I don't know. My anticipation, this is just my anticipation, is that they should be making those awards before the 2026 NOFO is released. And I say that because there's some administrative processes that need to happen before NOFOs are released that include a listing of currently funded projects. So I am anticipating that within the next 2 months, HUD should be making the award announcements for our existing projects that are up for renewal. We're keeping an eye on this, and that's the best I can say at this point.
Okay, thank you. So that would be mid-June. End
Hopefully.
of June. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, Teresa's question, I mentioned the 10 million bonus, 5 million DV bonus, and the reallocations. That is the total amount. That is, yes. That is the total amount that we are currently anticipating to be available for new projects. It could be very different, again, depending on when the NOFO is released. we are making these assumptions based on what was in the 2025 NOFO. So that $10 million, $5 million number align with what we saw in the 2025 NOFO. It could be a lot more. It could be less. It's the best guess that we have at this point.
Hey, Amanda, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Just a quick, I'm really rusty on the process, just kind of pinch hitting today. Budget. So how does it work in terms of approving a project as is, or if the budget comes in, say, beyond what the CoC is willing to fund, do you do adjustments for that, or will you just not fund the project based on the budget submitted?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do always, we have, kind of language in the RFP that we may negotiate a budget. If we think that the project is really strong, if we think it aligns with the CoC needs, but it's like, oh, this budget either is requesting more than what we have. Is the agency willing to submit a lesser budget if that aligned with them? Like we do that, those kind of, I'll say negotiations for lack of a better word. If again, it's really going to depend on the project itself, right? Does it look like a strong project? Does it look like, again, something that would meet a need in the community? So Jean, I see your comment about the difference between rental assistance and leasing assistance. The one thing in the issue of time, if we have time for this, I will come back, but I will note that we do give a definition of the different types of these budget lines in the RFP. So I would, and again, if we have time at the end, I will revisit that, but I do want to make sure that we get through some of the other content. I'm going to talk a little bit more about budgets a little bit later on too. So some of these budget questions I might put a hold on. All right, and Jenny's going to end this section with some good news. That Q2 grant announcement, so for those existing projects, could come as early as next week. That would be great because we have some existing CoC funded projects where their grant terms are ending at the end of this month, and they are desperately waiting for those announcements. So thank you, Jenny. With that, we're going to continue on just for the next little bit. So again, going back to reminder, if you submitted in January, regardless of if you decide to confirm that you want your January submission reviewed or if you withdraw it, you can still submit additional new project applications under this RFP. The world is your oyster. There is no limit. The only limit is the time that you have to put together in developing these applications. I do also want to draw your attention to, in the RFP, there's this decision-making tree in one of the appendices. I would encourage you, this again applies if you submitted in January. If you're still a little unclear of what you need to do, take a look at this decision-making tree. Hopefully that will help clarify. If you're still unclear, please reach out to me. Please reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to clarify. Okay. All right, I'm going to kind of continue on. So right now, we're going to talk about the RFP that is out and go through some details. So again, if you are here on this call, or even if you watch this webinar later, you are welcome to respond to the RFP and these applications that are currently out. Even if you did not apply in January, that doesn't matter. We reopened this for everyone that may be interested in applying for new funding. So I'm going to take the next few minutes to talk through broadly what are the types of projects that can be applied for. So that's what we're going to dive into. So the types of new projects that we're considering: transitional housing. This includes transitional or TH projects targeted to people fleeing domestic violence. You can submit street outreach, what we call a standalone supportive services only, and coordinated entry SSO, including for targeted to domestic violence. For expansion grants, we have two types of projects. This is quite limited that can be applied for expansion funding. That is our existing coordinated entry agencies and our dedicated HMIS project, which would be our HMIS lead agency only. So what do we mean when we say new project? So a new project is essentially a project that does not currently receive CoC funding. This could be a project that is currently in operations and that you want to apply for and receive funding to augment the services, expand the services, or this could be for new projects. It could be something that's not yet in operation, that hasn't gotten off the ground yet, but you have a plan, you have a proposal. That is largely what we mean when we say new projects. Expansion projects, those are grants for existing CoC funded projects that are requesting additional funding for their project. So again, this year, expansion grants are limited to coordinated entry and our dedicated HMIS grants. Excuse me. For those of you who have been around for a while, you may know that in the past, we considered expansion projects for PSH or RAPID. Again, given the limitation on funding here, we're not considering expansion grants for anything other than coordinated entry and HMIS. And because those expansion grants have to come from the existing grantee, there's limited in terms of who can apply for those expansion funding. It's those agencies that currently hold our coordinated entry grants or our dedicated HMIS grants. From HUD's perspective, both new projects and expansion projects are considered new. They're also considered new from the CoC's perspective as well. Okay, so again, we will not be considering applications for permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, or that joint component project type. Touched on that already. Also, just want to make a note that CoC funding cannot fund new safe haven projects, emergency shelters. There's a bit of a caveat to that, which I will talk about in a moment, or prevention projects. Regarding emergency shelters, largely the CoC funding does not fund shelters. The one caveat is that with the supportive services only funding that's available, that may fund services that take place within shelters. The CoC funding cannot fund like shelter operations, like the building itself. Okay. Again, touched on this briefly. These charts are also in the RFP material, so I encourage you to, everything I'm going over here is in the RFP in a lot more detail, but just a summation of, again, types of projects that can be funded with the types of funding. So as you can see, this is our CoC bonus funding, and any reallocated funding that we may have can fund our transitional housing, the street outreach, supportive services only, and those coordinated entry or HMIS grants. For domestic violence bonus, again, these are projects that must serve people fleeing domestic violence. We will only be able to consider transitional housing grants or a coordinated entry grant, with the caveat that that coordinated entry grant must specifically be providing services to people fleeing domestic violence. Excuse me. So, real briefly, for the domestic violence bonus projects, these projects, if they are funded, must serve people who meet what's called the Category 4 definition of homelessness. And that definition is given in the RFP. So I would encourage you to be sure you review it and are familiar with that definition. In sum, it's people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. And that can be defined as, intimate partner violence, dating violence, sexual assault. There's, a range there. HUD does consider people who are fleeing or attempting to flee human trafficking, whether that's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, as homeless under this Category 4 definition. Therefore, a domestic violence bonus project may be targeted to people who are fleeing human trafficking. However, a DV bonus project may not exclusively target or serve that population. So this is kind of a caveat and a nuance that has been in the NOFOs for the past couple of years regarding the ability of these DV bonus projects to serve people that are fleeing human trafficking. They may be a target population, but they cannot be the population that is exclusively served by those programs. So if you are submitting a new project application, there is no limit to the amount of funding that you can request. I guess I would encourage you to refer back to what we have said previously in terms of the total amount of funding that we have available. So keep that in mind as you are developing your budget requests. You may request a multi-year budget. One thing to note is that you do need to demonstrate a 25% match. So sometimes that match requirement may limit how much funding an agency can apply for, because you do have to be able to match whatever you apply for. In terms of project start dates, if your project is funded, if it is a new project, we anticipate that the start date will be the latter part of 2027. So even if you are submitted to HUD for funding, and even let's say we find out by the end of this calendar year that your project is funded, it's going to be probably closer to the end of 2027 before you get that money and you're able to start the programming. That is typically what we see. So I would just encourage you to take that into consideration as you're thinking through your project. For expansion grants, again, if any expansion grants are funded, they will have the same timeline as the current project. All right. In terms of eligibility criteria for who can apply. So this is eligibility criteria for eligible applicants for these funds. This is not people to be served eligibility. So in order to apply for these funds, you have to meet one of those 5 bullet points there. You need to be a nonprofit organization, including faith-based organizations. In Detroit, we have always invited and welcomed faith-based organizations to apply for these dollars. You could be a state or local government, a public housing agency, an institution, or an institution of higher education. Sorry, I guess there's 4 bullet points. One thing to note is that for-profit entities and individuals are not eligible for this funding. Again, that's a regulatory requirement. That's not something that the CoC made up. We have added a couple of additional, the CoC has added a couple of additional criteria. This applies to specifically to coordinated entry grants or the dedicated HMIS grants. Again, for the coordinated entry expansion grants and the dedicated HMIS expansion grants, those applications may only come from the existing grant holders, which just in transparency, HAND is one of those agencies because we do operate as the coordinated entry lead and the HMIS lead in Detroit. For domestic violence coordinated entry grants, any eligible applicant may apply for that. So referring to that list above, DV coordinated entry is open to any eligible applicant. Again, this is given in the RFP, so just ask that you review that closely. All right, I referred to coordinated entry already. Essentially, if your project is funded, you will be required to take referrals to your project only through our coordinated entry system, which is known locally as CAM. If you've heard that phrase before, that is what that means. This is the only way that you are going to be able to take referrals to your project is through our coordinated entry system. Again, this is a HUD requirement. This is not something that we made up. The goal of coordinated entry is to ensure that our resources are targeted to people most in need of the housing and services available. If you are new to this process and if your project is funded, HAND will work with you very diligently, and you get a lot more training, a lot more orientation to the coordinated entry process when or if we know if your project is funded. So just know that you're not going to kind of be left there on your own to figure it out. We will provide a lot of training and orientation to that. Likewise with HMIS, or the Homeless Management Information System, this is a data reporting system that if you are funded, your project, your agency will be required to use. This is a regulatory requirement. HAND is the HMIS lead agency. So if you are funded, you will receive all sorts of training and orientation from HAND staff on onboarding and training your agency. The extent of the training and the onboarding will depend based on your organization, your program, but we would do all of that assessment if your project is funded to determine what kind of training and orientation is needed. As a reminder, as you're developing your project budgets, there's an HMIS budget line that you can request to cover staffing costs, software costs, equipment costs for using the HMIS system. So while this is a requirement that you do need to comply with, resources are available that you can request to be able to comply with this requirement. So please keep that in mind as you are developing your budgets. HMIS is required, and you can get funding to help you meet those requirements. All right. I see some questions in the chat, so let me, some of these I'm going to put a hold on the questions just for now, just to get through these, because I might answer some of them as I go along. Okay, I'm going to talk about broadly some of the expectations for these different project types. The RFP goes into a lot more details, so again, please refer to the RFP. So for transitional housing projects may be either what we would call site-based or project-based, meaning the programming, the activities, people all live primarily in one building, or it could be maybe like a campus style, a couple of buildings that would still be considered kind of site-based, or they could be scattered site, meaning the client, the household identifies a apartment, a unit, a house in the continuum of care, boundaries and jurisdictions that they want to live in, and it's scattered throughout the city. So that's, again, the RFP gives some more details on the difference between what we mean by site-based and project-based. So HUD is going to be more likely to fund transitional housing projects that require service provision. Again, this goes with HUD's shift in priorities, that demonstrate that the project will provide 40 hours per week of services to each participant. There's a question in the application that does speak to that. If you're able to demonstrate success or a plan to exit people within 24 months to non-subsidized housing, transitional housing programs are time limited up to 24 months. And then if your project does have a treatment focus, a substance abuse treatment focused, HUD is more likely to fund the project if you do not use harm reduction as a treatment intervention. When I talked about earlier about HUD's shift in priorities and shifting towards wanting to see more treatment, HUD has made it clear that they do not consider harm reduction as being a appropriate intervention for substance abuse treatment. In the RFP, we do lay out some expected performance expectations for all of these project types. So just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over them here, but please take a look at them because that will give you an idea of, again, the performance that we are expecting, like the performance measures, what we're expecting your project, your program to strive for if it's funded. Okay, for street outreach programs, you can provide either what is called basic needs or navigation outreach. Again, these are detailed within the RFP in terms of what we mean by basic needs or navigation outreach. This is how we define them locally. We have modeled this process after how the city of Detroit models their RFPs for street outreach programs. The ultimate goal of street outreach is to help people who are in an unsheltered situation to move off the streets into shelters, transitional housing, permanent housing, what have you, treatment. Basically, the goal of street outreach is to move people from an unsheltered situation to a sheltered situation. HUD will expect street outreach programs to cooperate with law enforcement if there are encampments that need to be cleared. This is another part of HUD's shift in priorities. I will note that here in Detroit, we do have a pretty thorough policy on encampment clearances if or when that needs to happen. And so street outreach providers are expected to cooperate with that. There are links in the RFP to that, or the application materials to that policy, just to be aware of that. Lastly, for the standalone supportive services, this is really broad in terms of the types of services that may be provided. Again, review the RFP for details. In general, this could look like providing education or employment services, legal services, case management services, childcare, transportation. There is a wealth of types of services that can be provided in these standalone supportive services grants. A couple of caveats is that these programs cannot provide services to people currently residing in permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing, because those individuals are not considered homeless for purposes of eligibility for these services. These services could be provided within an emergency shelter setting, because people residing in emergency shelters are considered homeless and therefore would be eligible to receive these services. So this is that one example where I said CoC funding does not fund shelters. We kind of don't. We don't fund, like, the operations of shelters, like maintenance, utility, that kind of thing. But we do have the opportunity to fund services that could take place within a shelter environment. Ultimately, the goal of any of these standalone supportive services is to help people move to permanent housing and increase their self-sufficiency. So the last one I'm going to touch on is the requirements for these coordinated entry grants. Again, it's detailed in the RFP. The coordinated entry grants can request funding to provide access services, navigation services, or other activities, but a need would need to be demonstrated. The RFP details what we mean by access and navigation. Again, if you are considering requesting DV bonus funds for coordinated entry, whatever services are provided must be specifically targeted to people fleeing domestic violence. Okay, before we switch over to talking about the budget spreadsheets, I'm going to take a look at the chat, some questions. So Elena's question, is there a space where if a nonprofit wants to renovate a purchased property, can this be added to the budget? So transitional housing programs may request what we call hard costs, or costs related to acquisition, new construction, or rehabilitation. So that would be an allowable cost for transitional housing programs to request in their budget this year. Only transitional housing programs. So supportive services only, street outreach, because would not be able to request those types of costs, only for a transitional housing program. Yeah, the request for that decision tree, we can put that back up at the end. Sure, walk through that again. So Jean, your question, will the standalone project, supportive services only project, be scored on clients being exited to permanent housing without any government funding? So in terms of what types of project outcomes are we going to be looking for those standalone supportive services only projects? I would imagine, likely yes. I mean, with all of our projects, the ultimate goal is to help the individuals, help end their homelessness, right? Like that's the ultimate overarching goal of all of these programs, is to get people to no longer be homeless. So there likely will, so whether that means moving to non-subsidized permanent housing or moving to a housing voucher, I anticipate we will probably for a while look at both, because there is still value in both, right? Some people will be able to successfully end their homelessness by moving to a Section 8 voucher, a Section 8 unit. Other people will be able to successfully end their homelessness by moving to non-subsidized housing. So we will likely include both in future evaluation criteria. I don't know that we were, at this point, would only expect non-subsidized housing. I think we want to take a broader look at that. Does HAND have estimates of referrals or possible caseloads for street outreach and SSO needs? So I can't say that we do at this point. I would say that is something as you're developing your application, based on the funding that you want that you feel comfortable requesting, based on the amount of staff that you would feel comfortable bringing online, and then, kind of estimating what a caseload could be based on that. Particularly for the SSOs, it's going to depend on the type of programming that's offered because it is so broad. So that could really vary in terms of appropriate caseload sizes. So I can't say that I'm able to give additional guidance other than that. Okay, can explain how substance use treatment services can be used as leverage. So we do have in the RFP, and we have included as an appendix in the RFP, some details on leveraging non-CoC funded healthcare or housing resources. One of those types of, healthcare resources that could be leveraged would be substance use treatment. So an example of how this could look is if you have an agreement or an arrangement with a provider that is providing substance abuse treatment, and that provider is not CoC funded, but you have maybe an MOU or some type of agreement in place with them where they say, yes, we'll provide our services to these clients. And, particularly if they're providing them maybe like as an in-kind basis, if you're able to document the value of those services, normally our services would be X number of dollars an hour, but we're going to provide them to you on an in-kind basis. Like you can estimate like what that would cost if you were paying for them apart from that partnership. So it really comes down to being able to document what the value of those services would be, and then being able to document that you have that partnership agreement with that substance abuse provider to provide those services to the people in your program. So I hope that helped. Okay, let me see. So Linda, if you withdraw, when is the application due? So if you are going to withdraw anything that you submitted in January, everything is due by 11:59 p.m. on May 8th. Even if you withdraw and you want to submit a new application, everything is due by May 8th. So if you want to withdraw and resubmit something new, you could get that withdrawal form in now and then get the new project application in by May 8th. But at the end of the day, 11:59 p.m., May 8th, anything received after that will not be considered. Question regarding match. Hiring interns or volunteers could count as in-kind, correct? Yes. Match can be either cash or it can be in-kind. If it is an in-kind match, ultimately HUD would want to see some documentation of the value of that in-kind match. And I do give some details to that in kind of the budget instructions as well. Yep, HMIS staff is an eligible line item. I touched on that. Are the standalone SSO projects allowed to participate in tax credit or project-based units? So I'm assuming you mean, can they provide services within tax credit or project-based units? I'm going to say no, because those individuals are not considered homeless. If they are housed in a tax credit project, a project-based unit project, they're housed, they're not homeless, and so they're not going to be eligible for those standalone supportive service only projects. So Don's question, has the scoring criteria and points changed from the January submission? No. The RFP that we released just this week, the questions, the scoring criteria, the point value, everything is the same as what it was when we had previously released it in November and what you had responded to in November. So that was, again, why if you submitted in November, you don't need to resubmit, because we did not make any changes to that point. So any applicants that are going to be reviewed, you're all on the same playing field, I guess you could say, in terms of the questions you're answering and the scoring criteria that you're being evaluated against. Okay, if we confirm our previous application from January, are we able to apply in this RFP in addition to it? Yes. If you submitted in January and you want that application to still go forward, please confirm, and then you can apply for another new project, 5 more new projects, however many new projects you want under this RFP. There's no limit. All right, Dawn's question. Can you provide examples of leveraged housing resources and what kind of documentation would suffice? So we do give some of this guidance in an appendix of the RFP. I kind of touched on this a little bit regarding the healthcare resources. For housing, the main example that I've seen is like if you have another source of funding that provides, it says applied primarily in the past with PSH projects. If it was like a tax credit project or a project that has project-based vouchers to it, something else that was providing the subsidy to that project that was not CoC funded. We are in a bit of a new environment now in the fact that we are not accepting applications for PSH or Rapid. So examples on how to leverage another housing resource for like a transitional housing program. I might have to think on that a little bit, to be honest, because this is a bit new to us. So I might need to follow up with you on that, Dawn. I apologize. And in terms of leveraging, yes, like for example, a contract with DWIN DWIN is going to be, able to provide services to that project that would be a source of healthcare leveraging. If our leverage is also outperforms for dollars raised, does that also qualify as match? Yes, your leveraging can also be used as match. It's going to depend on what it is you're leveraging. So it could. Leveraging and match could be kind of the same, or they could be different. It's going to kind of depend on that source that you are looking to leverage or match. Okay, yeah. If you apply for SSO funding, can you have a rental assistance line? So unfortunately, no. Standalone supportive service only projects may only request supportive services line, as you can also request HMIS and an admin line. So supportive service only projects cannot administer rental assistance. So you cannot provide 1 month's rent, security deposits. Those are not eligible costs for SSO grants. And this is detailed in the RFP, these particular types of budget lines that you can apply for. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about the budget spreadsheets. And actually, I'm just going to switch over to our website. I'm going to drop this link in the chat if you have not already viewed it. So everything, the RFP, all of the application materials, today's recording and slides will ultimately be posted here. But this is the website that you want to keep tabs on. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger. So everything that you need is here. I want to talk a bit about the budget spreadsheets. There are 2 different types of budget spreadsheets, and you're going to want to be sure to download and complete the correct one based on what you're applying for. If you are a transitional housing project requesting capital costs, this, as it's labeled here, budget spreadsheet for transitional housing projects requesting capital costs. To try to be real clear, this is the spreadsheet that you want to download. In this spreadsheet, you will see budget lines that will allow you to request costs for acquisition, so to acquire the property, rehab a property, or build a new property. So if that applies to you, this is the budget spreadsheet that you want to use. For everyone else, if you are a transitional housing project not requesting those hard costs, if you are street outreach, supportive services, anyone else, you're going to use this second spreadsheet. Because in this spreadsheet, the budget lines will not include those hard costs, those capital costs. And honestly, it's a little bit more straightforward to fill out. If you are requesting those capital costs, there's just a little bit more work that you're going to have to do, which is fine. If that's what you want to request, just be aware of that. I will also note, as you can see here, there are 2 instructional videos for these spreadsheets. One is for the one requesting capital cost. The other one is for the spreadsheet not requesting capital costs, are like 15 to 17 minutes long. Please watch those instructional videos, just because we are about at time, and we can certainly hang on for a few more minutes. But just in the interest of time, I pre-recorded those videos. I appreciate Dawn's encouragement. Those videos were recorded last fall in November. I don't think they refer to anything regarding like a January submission date. I don't think I say any dates in there. If I do, just be aware, everything is due May 8th. These happen to have been recorded last fall. The information is still relevant. Those videos will walk you through how to complete the budget spreadsheets. They will discuss the types of costs that you can request and how to complete the budget spreadsheet. So please take some time to review them, and hopefully that will provide kind of the details that are needed. Additionally, when you're completing your budget, in the RFP materials towards the latter pages, I think it's Appendix D. There's a lot of appendices in this RFP. I pulled from the CoC regulations allowable costs. So if you are wondering, hey, I want to request an operations line, what can I pay for with operations? I pulled straight from the regulations what you can pay for with an operations budget line. If you still have questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to kind of clarify anything that you may have questions about there. Okay, let me switch back over to my slides. Again, as I showed, all of the materials are on HAN's website. This recording and the slides will be posted there by early next week. Everything is due by 11:59 p.m. on May 8th. And when I say everything, I mean if you're submitting that confirmation or withdrawal form, that is due by 11:59 on May 8th. If that confirmation or withdrawal form is not submitted by then, we are going to assume that you are withdrawing your January submission. If you want to apply for any new funding, if you're here for the first time, this is the first time you're throwing your hat in the ring, it's due May 8th. If you applied in January and you want to apply for something else or something more, it's due May 8th. Anything submitted after that deadline will not be reviewed. Do not wait until the last minute to submit. Please do not wait until the last minute to submit. There unfortunately have been times when agencies have waited until 2 minutes before the deadline, and then the email does not go through and it comes too late. So just don't do that to yourself or to me. I will send you an email confirmation just confirming that I have received your application material. So you can keep that email confirmation on your end and your files just to confirm that you got everything in. Okay. I think I got the questions in the chat. I don't think I missed anything, but let me just do another review. If you have questions as you're going along, number one, please read the RFP. It's 60 some pages of delightful reading. So, but there are a lot of details there, really important details to know. And if you have a question, it may be answered in that document. If you have a question that is not answered, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to entertain questions. if I can't answer your question because it might like give you an unfair advantage over another applicant, I'll tell you that. But if it's, you know, a question related to what can I use this funding for? Can I do this? Can I do that? What is it that I need to submit? Don't be afraid to ask. I would rather be safe than sorry. Just ask the question. And if I can't answer it, I'll let you know. All right, we are about at time, but I will just pause to see if there is anything else that, again, I think I got everything in the chat. If there's anything I missed in the chat, or if anyone wants to come off of mute and ask anything. Okay.
Hi, Amanda.
Yes.
Hi, it's Sharita. How you doing?
Hi, I'm well. How are you?
Okay, I think we're both trying to get over a cold, actually. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I just had to ask you a quick question about capacity building. So outside of the line item for the HMIS, are any of the grant opportunities available for that?
Can you clarify what you mean by capacity building?
Sorry, like in order to run these services that we're requesting funding for these different projects, employing people to actually handle the program.
So yes, you can request funding for staff costs, for if you need to hire case management staff or a program director, a therapist, a counselor. So all staffing costs are eligible. On the HMIS side, again, because use of the HMIS is required, you can request staffing costs specifically for staff to do HMIS. So really, yeah, broad range of staffing costs are eligible.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Again, thank you for putting up with me with my cold. Hopefully I will feel better soon. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. And thank you all. I will.
Amanda, one quick question.
Oh, yes, Carl, go ahead.
Have you posted the form on the site yet, or it's not there yet?
Yes, everything is posted on HAND's website. I did put the link in the chat just a minute ago. I can repost it though before we end the call, just so folks have it.
So
but
I
yes,
can let you know that I'm going to leave mine as is.
Perfect. All right. Yep. Everything is posted there, posted on the website. Everything you need. So.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Amanda, you guys have
Wonderful.
a great day.
Thanks all. Take care.